So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for attending and to all of the organising and work and campaigning, all the vigils, all the demos, all the picketing outside Barclays, all the work we've all been doing to try and stand in solidarity with our Palestinian sisters and brothers. And I want to thank the team from Palestine Solidarity Campaign Oxford and from Oxford and Ramallah Friendship Association for organising this event. And obviously to Uton Daly, who's brilliantly organising our sound system, Zoe, who's on video, and to our sponsors, Oxford Unite Health Branch, the CWU, the Communication Workers Union, and the Oxford District Trades Union Council, and to all the staff at the church here. And with that, we're going to start by hearing from Professor Avi Shlaim, who really needs no introduction at all. Avi is an Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the British Academy. He's written many books, including Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement and Partition of Palestine, War and Peace in the Middle East, A Concise History, The Iron Wall, a classic, Israel and the Arab World, which has an updated edition for all of you who want to update your libraries. Line of Jordan, The Life of King Hussein in War and Peace, and the one I'm reading at the moment, Three Worlds, Memoir of an Arab Jew, which is truly inspiring and gives us hope for a better future. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Hosnieh. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have 20 minutes to talk about the past. This meeting is about Gaza, past, present, and future, and my patch is the past, and I'll try and give a brief history of Gaza coming to the present. So, to begin with, there are two levels of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The intercommunal level, which is Jews and Palestinians in Palestine, and the interstate level, which is the relations between the State of Israel and the neighboring Arab states. In origin and in essence, the Arab-Israeli conflict is a clash between Jewish nationalism or Zionism and Palestinian nationalism. This is the heart of the conflict. The Arab states got involved on the side of the Palestinians in the late 1930s, and they began to disengage under Anwar Sadat in the late 1970s. But they remain involved in one way or another until the present. But the core of the problem is the Palestinian issue. In 1947, the UN voted for the partition of Palestine into two states, one Arab, one Jewish. The Palestinian state never materialized, and the State of Israel materialized and extended its borders beyond the 55% allowed by the UN to 78% of mandatory Palestine. That's everything except the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And in the course of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israel carried out the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and many Palestinians ended up in Gaza. So that's when Gaza first got filled up with refugees, and today I believe that refugees and their descendants are 80% of the population of Gaza. So this was the Nakba. 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, and the name Palestine was wiped off the map. In 1956, during the Suez War, when Israel, in collusion with Britain and France, attacked Egypt, and the Israeli army occupied Gaza for 6 months, during which a lot of war crimes were committed, a foretaste of what was to come much later. In 1967, Israel completed the occupation of the whole of Palestine, and including the Gaza Strip. And Israel occupied the Gaza Strip from 1967 until 2005. This was a classic colonial occupation. 8,000 Jewish settlers controlled 25% of the territory and 40% of the arable land, as well as the lion's share of the desperately scarce water resources. Gaza is not poor and underdeveloped because the people in Gaza are lazy. It's because Israel had a deliberate strategy of keeping it poor and backward. And the best book on this is Sarah Roy, a Jewish scholar at Harvard, and her book is called The Gaza Strip, The Political Economy of De-Development. So Gaza was never allowed to develop by a deliberate Israeli strategy of keeping it poor and underdeveloped. In 2005, Israel decided to withdraw from Gaza unilaterally. This was not part of an agreement with the Palestinian Authority. It was not part of a peace plan. It was a unilateral Israeli move undertaken for Israeli national interests. Hamas attacks and harassment in Gaza persuaded the Israeli government that the gain was no longer worth the candle. So that's why they withdrew, for selfish reasons. But they had the chutzpah to say that they were, by withdrawing from Gaza, they were giving the people a chance to turn Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East. And in January 2006, Hamas won a fair and free election, not just in the Gaza Strip, but in the West Bank as well. A fair and free election in which they won an absolute majority and proceeded to form a Hamas-led government. Israel refused to recognize the Hamas government, and Israel resorted to economic warfare to undermine this government. The United States and European Union, to their eternal shame, sided with Israel in refusing to recognize the Hamas government and in resorting also to economic measures to undermine this government. So this is one example of many of Western hypocrisy. They say they are for democracy. Here was a shining example of Arab democracy in action, all the more remarkable because it was achieved under conditions of Israeli military occupation. The people have spoken, but in Western eyes, they voted for the wrong bunch of politicians. So the Hamas was not allowed to govern, having won a democratic mandate. In power, it moderated its program. Its original program was a unitary Muslim country from the river to the sea. But once they were in power, they moderated the program to asking for a Palestinian state, independent Palestinian state, along the 1967 borders. And their leaders repeatedly stated that was the aim, and they offered Israel negotiations on a long-term ceasefire. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, Israel refused to negotiate. In 2007, Hamas and Fatah formed a national unity government. It was a moderate government that renewed the offer to negotiate a long-term ceasefire, and also renewed the offer to negotiate on a two-state solution. Once again, Israel and its Western allies refused to negotiate. But it was worse than that. As we know from the Palestine papers that were leaked to Al Jazeera, a secret committee was formed called the Gaza Committee. It consisted of Fatah, Israel, America, and Egyptian intelligence. And the aim of this secret committee was to isolate Hamas, to weaken Hamas, and to drive it out of power. So there was a plot against the democratically elected government. And Israel and America armed and encouraged Fatah to stage a coup against Hamas. In June 2007, Hamas preempted the coup by Fatah and seized power in Gaza. And since then, the West Bank has remained under the rule of Hamas, and the West Bank under the rule of Fatah through the Palestinian Authority. Following the seizure of power in Gaza, Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza. So there's been an Israeli blockade ever since 2007, long before the present war. And a blockade is a form of collective punishment which is prescribed by international law. And yet the international community has done nothing about this Israeli violation, gross Israeli violation of international law. In 2008, there was fighting between Israel and Hamas, and Egypt negotiated a ceasefire. The ceasefire worked really well, and Hamas observed it scrupulously. Israel, when it no longer seated itself, violated the ceasefire with a raid on Gaza. The fighting was renewed, and Hamas renewed the offer to Israel of the ceasefire on the original terms. Israel disregarded the Hamas offer and launched in December 2008 Operation Cast Lead, the first Israeli military offensive in Gaza. I stress that Hamas respected the ceasefire because Hamas has a very good record of honoring agreements and honoring ceasefire. All the ceasefire agreements between Hamas and Israel were honored by Hamas and violated by Israel. After the first war in Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, the UN appointed the Goldstone Commission of Inquiry. They produced an excellent, very long report which documented war crimes. It concluded that Hamas was guilty of war crimes, but it reserved its severest criticisms for Israel because of the scale of the Israeli war crimes. And there were 7 examples of Israeli soldiers shooting dead civilians in the street, civilians holding white flags. The conclusion of the Goldstone report was that this was not an Israeli attack on Hamas, it was an attack on the whole people of Gaza. And the aim of this attack was, quote, to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the people of Gaza. So this was the first attack. By my count, the present Israeli assault on Gaza is the 8th round of operations. There have been more Israeli military offensives in Gaza in 2012, 2014, 2021, 2022, 2033, earlier in 2023, before the 7th of October. Israel has no policy on Gaza. This is a political dispute. Israel has no political solution, just military repression and violence. There is an Israeli saying that if force doesn't work, use more force. This is an asinine idea, because if force doesn't work, it's because this instrument is not fit for dealing with a political problem. Israeli generals have a phrase, a chilling phrase, mowing the lawn. What this means is that every couple of years, the Israeli army moves into Gaza and bombards it by air, sea, by land, air, and sea. They smash up the place. They destroy a lot of the civilian infrastructure. They degrade the military capability of Hamas, and then they go home until the next round of destruction. So this is the history of Gaza over the last 8 Israeli assaults. And with this metaphor, mowing the lawn is a mechanical thing that you do periodically without end. The next war is always round the corner. Benjamin Netanyahu's policy is to prevent a Palestinian state. That's the basic overriding aim, to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. And his policy was to weaken the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, in the West Bank. And the Palestinian Authority is totally ineffectual. It's illegitimate because there have been no elections since 2006. And effectively, it's a subcontractor for Israeli security. So it offers no resistance. And in Gaza, it's governed by Hamas, and Netanyahu was happy for a weak Hamas to govern Gaza and to contain the people of Gaza inside the prison of Gaza. So it's not an attempt to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but to manage the conflict. And he congratulated himself on his success in neutralizing both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas until the 7th of October, when the Hamas attack came to Israelis as a complete surprise and as a trauma. The message behind the Hamas attack is that Netanyahu is wrong. We are not finished. The Palestinians cannot be sidelined. The Palestinian resistance will continue. The Palestinian Authority may be ineffectual and collaborationist, but Hamas will continue to lead the struggle for Palestinian freedom and independence. This was the message. Israel claims that it has the right to self-defense, but it is not. It's the Palestinians who, under international law, have the right to resistance, including armed resistance. The scale of the current Israeli attack on Gaza is without precedent. It's the most destructive and lethal and the most vicious attack. And the casualties in the last 4 months far exceed the total of the last previous military offensives. And Israel's war aim has changed. Netanyahu's new war aim is not to manage the conflict, but to destroy Hamas, to eradicate Hamas. This is impossible because Hamas is not just an organization, it's also an idea, the idea of Palestinian freedom and Palestinian independence, and you cannot kill an idea. But this is his war aim, to eradicate Hamas, as he puts it. And Netanyahu needs a long war. Why does he need a long war? Because he knows that once the war is over, the countdown will begin to the end of his premiership. Not only that, but he stands trial on 3 serious corruption charges, so he may well end up in jail. This is why he needs a long war. There's been a lot of genocidal rhetoric accompanying the Israeli actions in Gaza, from the president through the prime minister to the ministers, shocking genocidal rhetoric. And the trouble with genocidal rhetoric is that it paves the way to genocidal actions. And today, Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza, also cultural genocide. Israel is a settler colonial state, and the logic of settler colonialism is not to compromise, not to find ways of coexistence, but to eliminate the natives. This is what Israeli settler colonialism has been about since the Balfour Declaration. But now it's reached a very extreme stage, because ethnic cleansing has failed, and therefore Israel is moving to the next stage, which is genocide. And this was the point of the South African petition to the International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice ruling was a landmark. It's a historic landmark. It said to Israel, you are not above the law. You are subject to international law like everyone else. And what you are doing in Gaza is a violation of the laws of war, and you must take immediate measures to limit the damage to civilians, to allow the free flow of humanitarian aid, and thirdly, to curb the genocidal rhetoric. Israel has done none of these things. It intensified the attack on civilians, and it's still blocking and obstructing the flow of aid. May I have one?
Of course, yeah.
I was going to say something about America, because America is responsible for Israel getting away literally with murder. And a few days ago, America vetoed a ceasefire resolution at the Security Council for the 3rd time. Just think of it. The whole international community wants a ceasefire. It's the obvious thing. And America alone blocks it. So America is not just complicit in Israeli war crimes. America is an active partner alongside Israel in enabling the genocide that is going on. And now there is talk about the day after. What will happen after the end, after the fighting come to an end? America is an imperialist power, and it would like to revive the long-defunct two-state solution. It would like to bring the Palestinian Authority to take back charge of Gaza. And it's not for an imperial outside power to tell the Palestinians what to do. It's up to the Palestinians to decide what kind of a government they want. And Israel and America are not going to listen to the Palestinians, and they don't respect the right of the Palestinians to national self-determination. So I think the two-state solution is not a solution. To my mind, you call me naive if you like, but to my mind, the only democratic solution is one democratic state from the river to the sea with equal rights for all its citizens. Thank you.
Also on to you. Thank you very much, Professor. That was really, really enlightening, and it really speaks to what we see, which is a Western hypocrisy at a level that I think before we could sometimes pretend that it wasn't there, but it has really reached its peak at the moment. Everyone watching Parliament yesterday, the fact that the Labour leader, 10 of us councillors resigned from Labour, as many of you know, when this horrendous assault massacres on Gaza started in the council, a protest of what the Labour position was, which was effectively saying that Israel has a right to defend itself and no limits being placed, or Palestinian human rights hardly being mentioned really. And the Labour leader last night blocked the SNP motion because they wanted to remove the line about collective punishment. It's absolutely extraordinary because everything that we've all witnessed, and we are about to move on to Professor Nick Maynard and Dr. Deborah Harrington, who've just come back from Gaza, but everything we've all seen and witnessed on our mobile phones, and the horrendous acts that the Israeli soldiers have been themselves filming, cycling on dead children's bikes. It is actually extremely shocking to witness that, and yet we're not allowed to use the term collective punishment. But with that, I'm going to move on to Professor Nick Maynard, who's a friend and a colleague, and who's a consultant upper GI surgeon, upper gastrointestinal surgeon, medical speak, at Oxford University Hospitals, and associate professor of surgery at Oxford University. And he set up the Oxford Esophageal Cancer Centre and is a leading surgeon there, and I have the pleasure of anaesthetising for Nick quite often, and he is as smiley and he's such a great team worker and a great leader in theatre there, as I'm sure you've all seen him since he's been in the news quite a lot since working in Gaza. He first visited Palestine in 2008. He's been visiting Gaza regularly, and in each October he leads a group of us Oxford consultants specialising in a range of specialities to teach medical students from the two universities in Gaza. And he also works with Medical Aid for Palestinians. We'll be raising some money for Medical Aid for Palestinians at the end of this event. And he went as part of their surgical team to carry out and teach advanced surgery. And in December 2023, he led the first UK mission into Gaza during the current conflict. And he worked at Al-Aqsa Hospital for 2 weeks. He'll be returning there shortly. Nick, I just want to ask you about really starting with what Gaza under siege was like over the years and what the impact you saw on the healthcare system was like. But you've also spoken really movingly about how things were so different there that you didn't feel you were prepared for it. How was it different, and what would our Palestinian healthcare worker colleagues like us all to know about?
Thank you, Hosnieh. We work with each other. You said you worked for... Anita and Zoe work with each other. So I always talk about... So I've been going to Gaza since 2010, and I always talk about what I've considered to be, and more importantly, what the Gazan people considered to be normal Gaza. And it became a fairly, in some respects, a normal trip over there, but of course it wasn't remotely normal by anyone else's standards. It was a very abnormal place to be there in many ways because it's been under siege, as we've heard from Avi and from Hosnieh. And you talked about it being a prison. In prison, prisoners get visitation rights, don't they? And they get privileges. They don't exist in Gaza, so it's in many ways much more like a concentration camp than a prison. And working in the healthcare system out there, we get used to it, and every single trip, it never ceased to amaze me how wonderfully talented the Gazan doctors, nurses, paramedics, healthcare workers were. The medical students who we, for many years, were concentrating on were every bit as bright as the students we teach in Oxford. And they are a remarkably beautiful and resilient people out there. So we all grew to love Gaza, and it's a strong feature of all the trips we've taken out there that once you've been there, you have to go back. When Debbie and I and others left a few weeks ago, all we've been able to talk about and think about is getting back out there to that beautiful country. The healthcare system, though, is hugely challenged. In quiet times, in normal times, it's very, very challenging providing top-level healthcare out there, but they managed to achieve it within the restraints of the healthcare system they live under. They're always short of resources. It's completely controlled by the Israelis as what is allowed to get in there, and they are always worried about resources running out. But they coped admirably well. And then, of course, post-October the 7th, it has got catastrophically worse, as you could imagine. And we, Debbie and I and others who went in, we all know Gaza well. Since October the 7th, we've been talking or messaging daily to all our contacts in the hospitals there, particularly Shifa Hospital, before it became completely disabled. And we saw lots of videos and photographs that you would never have seen in the media over here. Horrible, horrible photographs, awful testimonies, audio, video testimonies. So we really thought we'd be ready for what we were going to see there. And I think I can speak for all of us, certainly for myself, I wasn't remotely prepared. Things were far, far worse than we had expected. We saw things in the hospital, in Al-Aqsa Hospital, which I would never, ever have expected to see in a healthcare system in a civilized world. Appalling injuries, mainly in kids and women. There's a narrative, of course, being peddled that they're only targeting Hamas militants, therefore young males. I operated on far more women than I did males. I think I spent most of the time in the operating theatre. Debbie was more in the emergency department with James, a colleague of ours. But when we went to the emergency department, we saw mainly a lot of children coming in with the most appalling injuries, many of whom you knew were going to die because there were not the resources to save them, or their injuries were so bad. And you couldn't give them pain relief. There was often no morphine. There was nowhere for them to die in dignity. So often they were just literally left lying on the floor of the corner of the emergency department to die. Deeply, deeply tragic. In the operating theatres, Hosnieh and I work a lot together. We're used to having, within reason, everything we want there. But we had to make do with very, very limited resources. On one day we were operating, there was no running water. So the only way we could scrub up was by using alcohol gel. On another day, there were no sterile drapes to put round the patient to keep a sterile field. So we had to adapt and cut up some gowns to try and create a sterile field. Instruments, you name it, we were very, very lacking in those. So there was you had to adapt a lot to the circumstances. So I guess in answer to your question, the challenges were enormous, and we saw things the like of which I would never, ever have hoped to have seen.
Thank you very much. And I think it must have also been hugely distressing for you, bearing witness to all of that. Because as medics, for example, we're not really, we're not used to seeing people suffering in that way without access to analgesia, anesthesia, and it must have been absolutely horrific. Nick, you've done a huge amount of advocacy. I'm sure everyone has seen you on various news channels, which has been absolutely brilliant. trying to get politicians to see what you've seen, and we've had a lot of discussions in our medic groups around the limits of humanitarianism and why. And I know that it's as medics, you feel that it is important for us to try and stick to what we know best, but at the same time, there are clearly limits that we've spoken about quite a lot. I guess I want to ask you, why do you think it is that despite the fact that you've spoken to lots of politicians, that they're really unprepared to act in a meaningful way? So there are lots of diplomatic, economic sanctions available to politicians, both in the US and, as Abby so brilliantly put it, a partner in these crimes, and the UK. And actually we see the beginnings of those, because I don't know whether you've all seen, but in Dutch Parliament there's actually been a stop put to F-39 plane parts being transferred to Israel, because the court was very concerned that the Dutch would be complicit. So why do you think it is that, for example, in the UK and in the US, they're unprepared to act, and how do we move things forward?
I'm not sure I know the answers to that, Hosnieh. I think we'd all agree this is the single biggest thing going on in the world at the moment, and I think the way that we as individuals, society, governments, it'll define us as to how we react to this. And I think we've seen how our politicians in the United Kingdom and America are reacting to this, and I simply do not understand why they're behaving like that. Debbie and I went down, we were invited to go down to London to meet Lord Cameron and Andrew Mitchell, amongst other healthcare workers who've been in Gaza, and I think I've always been an optimist. I always think the best of people, and I perhaps naively, Hosnieh thinks I'm very naive about this and told me not to expect anything, and I thought she was just being cynical, but of course she was right. So we went down, and it was profoundly disappointing, the reaction we got, and it was very much, I think, a tick box exercise. They wanted to say, yes, we've met the people who went into Gaza, we've heard them, and but this is what we think. And when we tried to suggest that a humanitarian pause or a sustainable ceasefire, this sort of mishmash of words they come up with, was not sufficient, and what was needed was an immediate, permanent, unconditional ceasefire, it wasn't accepted at all. In fact, they got rather shirty with us for doubting that what they were doing right, and it's been very disappointing. I've experienced a lot of censorship in some of the media interviews we've done, in some of the university talks I've given, and I mean, it's a very long-winded answer. The answer is I don't know. I have no idea. In the true sense of the word, I think it's incredible that they're behaving like this. I think it's absolutely unbelievable that so-called, well, they're not principled at all, are they? But people who are meant to be running our country can behave like this. And I think they're, as Avi said, I think they are absolutely complicit in what is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And I think we all know that we need better and different politicians, and for ones that are not about self-interest, but obviously that's a lot to expect. So just moving on, we're going to be speaking. Oh, sorry. Does that need to be good? Yes. Sorry, I forgot about the mic. Yeah. Thank you very much, Nick. And Nick is going to be going back to Gaza shortly as well. And yes, I'm sure we will all be wishing him all the best. And a huge thanks for all he's done. All of our medics who've gone out there, it's kind of standing in solidarity in a very practical sense that really deserves all of our respect and admiration, so thank you. Dr. Deborah Harrington is a consultant obstetrician and subspecialist in maternal and fetal medicine at Oxford University Hospitals. She specialises in the care of women with medically complex pregnancies and is an amazing listener, obstetrician, and her patients and her teaching styles are second to none. She has a strong interest in postgraduate medical education and is the head of the School of Obstetrics and Gynecology for the whole of the Thames Valley Deanery and Deputy Director of Medical Education at Oxford University Hospitals. And she's been also visiting Gaza since 2016 as part of the Medical Teachers Group to provide clinical teaching to medical students and postgraduate doctors in training. And she was also recently in Gaza as part of the emergency medical team with Medical Aid for Palestinians and the International Red Cross, where she worked at Al-Aqsa Hospital. You might have also seen the viral video of Debbie speaking to Christian Amanpour, which was posted by, I don't know how many millions of people watched it. And I think she spoke for so many of us when she said that she feels utterly ashamed. She feels utterly ashamed that we are allowing this to happen. So Deborah, can you tell us a little bit about, I know you work with women with more complex pregnancies, and that takes just a different level of compassionate care and true listening and learning. And what have you learned from the women of Gaza over the years, and I think especially in this most recent visit, which must have been horrific?
So I am absolutely committed to women getting what they deserve, really, and that doesn't matter where you are in the world. And what has struck me in this conflict, but actually what has struck me in all the other visits that we've done, is that the world isn't equal, and there is dual standards, really, and depending on the geography of where you're born has a huge impact on your life chances, and that to me just is wrong. And I know that that's also happens in the UK, but women have they actually have unique protections that are set out in the Geneva Convention. And women who are pregnant, there are additional protocols for maternity, for newborns, for young children. And I think, what's been happening in Gaza, what I saw, is that all of those conventions have been completely disregarded. Food, water insecurity, the complete destruction of hospitals, of clinics, of access to basic healthcare have been completely wiped out in this conflict and in other conflicts, actually. And that has a huge effect on women because women are always the people that suffer most in humanitarian situations, in particularly in conflicts. Not only are they impacted by what's happening in the war, they are, and as we know in Gaza, 70% of the people that have been killed are women and children. And that actually is sort of even compared to what had happened to all the other escalations in conflicts up until now during the siege of Gaza since 2007, 2008. And only about 14% of the people killed up to October the 7th in all of that time had been women and girls. But since October the 7th, it's 70% of women and children who've been impacted. And what I saw was women not getting, obviously being killed, but actually not having any access to basic care. So none of the women I saw had any antenatal care, or as when I've sort of done some stuff recently, the Americans will call it prenatal care, but no care in their pregnancy. They couldn't access anywhere it was really difficult to access a safe place to give birth. They couldn't access it because there wasn't a hospital. They had to go through, conflict, bombardment, bombing, shelling, firing. So they couldn't actually even get to the hospital. They couldn't call an ambulance because, as we know, the sort of mobile signal is down lots of the time, and actually to summon help is really difficult. And so women were giving birth in shelters, in camps, in tents, and the indignity of that, of giving birth, with no privacy, with no dignity, if things go wrong. And unfortunately, this is now a very unhealthy population, and even in healthy, low-risk populations, some women will become high risk and develop complications during their birth, during their labour. And it's estimated that in this situation, where you've got such an unhealthy population of pregnant women entering labour, that actually 40% of them may develop complications during the birth process. And if you don't have timely access to healthcare that could save you or your baby's life, then you may die. It's really as simple as that. And this is what is being inflicted on these women. And I'm in touch all the time with our colleagues that we've met over the years in Gaza, but particularly I've got a colleague who's an obstetrician in now what's the busiest maternity hospital in Rafah. It was a very small hospital before this conflict started, but it's now it's the main maternity provider. And he writes to me regularly, and one day, it was just such an awful story, and it was, we've had a really difficult day today. We've just lost a mother who has 6 children, and she's died of a pulmonary embolus because we couldn't get her intensive care, and she died in our arms. And I think it's these type of things. This woman wouldn't have died. It's all of these excess deaths. These women wouldn't have died. They would have had good care. Their babies might not have died. They wouldn't have had stillbirths or preterm births or small babies, because this is a direct outcome of the current situation.
Thank you very much, Emma. And before we move on to my question about white feminists, I was just going to say that I'm sure a lot of us have also seen those images of Palestinian men caring for their loved ones, and the images of that Palestinian grandfather kissing his granddaughter will never leave me. And I think it's really important that though obviously it's important that we advocate for women and children, that we do not allow this narrative that labels every single Palestinian man a terrorist. Moving back to white feminism, I've been really astonished. I haven't been astonished actually. I've been expecting it, but still felt a bit let down by the number of so-called feminists in the UK, many who write for The Guardian actually, who have not commented on any of these issues. The fact that 2 women a day are dying in Gaza, that Palestinian women have no access to basic care in childbirth, which I'm sure most of us who can just not even imagine. Deborah, why is it that so few British feminists and women's rights advocates, obviously with some exceptions, are prepared to speak up?
So the short answer is a bit like Nick's, I don't know. But it really disappoints me, and I think there's an absolute zone of silence, isn't there? And, I was brought up by a feminist mother. I hope I brought my girls up to be feminists. I hope I brought my boys up to be feminists. I think there is double standards, which I think is probably is Professor Abbey would tell us is something that has seen again and again in the Palestinian-Israeli situation, and the rest of the world seems to have double standards, and some people's lives seem to count more than others. And I think it's an extension of that. I'm not exactly sure what it is, whether it is fright at being able to speak up, but I would have thought that actually that goes against what feminism stands for. Surely it means that we're able to stand up for our rights and for the rights of other women and for the rights of humanity. I mean, that's what feminism to me means. So that's the first thing. I think we are. I think it's very easy to be this sort of liberal feminist, and even have foreign policies that are supposedly feminist, but actually when it really comes to putting those into practice, I think we see again and again that there's very little action. But I guess there is something that also that I think at the bottom of this is actually what do they mean? What does feminist foreign policies mean? What does it mean when actually there are women, there are mothers, there are children who are denied their basic protections, their protections of humanitarian law, let alone feminism.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, totally. I think many of us, people from the global south and from racialised minorities in the UK, brown and black women and Muslim women, I would say that a lot of us don't really empathise with some of the aspects of the feminist movement exactly for those reasons. So I'm going to move us on now. So we've now covered the past and what's happening to some extent, especially from the healthcare perspective in the present time. And I'm really pleased to have Shlaim and Maryam with us, who are going to talk a bit more about the future as they see it. Shlaim Lubbad is a good friend, is a full-time physicist and a doctorate candidate at the University of Oxford, working on the development of nuclear fusion energy. He's also an Arabic language poet, writer and TV presenter. His interests span Arabic literature, political history, modern science and technology, and the history of science. He's worked on various political history projects, museum curation and media production projects, and often pens columns for newspapers in the Middle East. Shlaim, thank you for being with us. You and many Palestinians that I've spoken to over recent times have described this not as just a pivotal moment, but a defining one. Can you tell us a bit more about why you think that is the case? And thank you, Deborah, for remembering the mic. Everyone else is remembering the mic, and I'm not. Thank you.
So how this is a defining moment, I believe that what's happening now first is when we talk about future, we realize that what's going on now in Gaza is shaping this future, not only the future of Gaza, but also the future of Palestine, and maybe beyond the future of the region. Because if Israel manages to expel the Palestinians in Gaza out of historic Palestine, then almost certainly we will see this is happening in Jerusalem and then the West Bank within the next 10 years maybe. And if Israel gets away with killing tens of thousands of Palestinians, of civilians in Gaza, and reducing an entire city into rubble, we will see this is happening in Beirut sooner or later. And it actually is not a secret that Israeli officials and ministers said that to threaten Lebanon. They said we will turn Beirut into another Gaza, and noting that they can't really use the human shield argument in Beirut because we know Hezbollah is active in the south, not in Beirut. But this is a statement and evidence that they want to use the destruction of civilian lives and civilian infrastructure as a deterrent to deter their political and military opponents, which is exactly what terrorist organizations do. And so it's important, like, the way we move on from this war is very critical because it will redefine, it will shape our future. But what's happening now, this genocide that's going on, regardless of how the international community wants to describe it, or even the ICJ rules about it, it will come down in history as a genocide, and it will define the Palestinians, our relationship with ourselves first, our relationship with our home, our relationship with our enemy and our friends. I think an important realization that we're coming to is that we can no longer trust anyone with anything. We can't trust anyone with our security, with the food we eat, with our resources, with the water we drink. We have to seize control of our daily life, everything that is to do with our daily life and everything that is to do with our destiny. We've seen that the international law can't protect us. Even the ICJ ruling and preventive measures that it ordered Israel to abide by, it didn't change anything. On the contrary, Israel intensified its attacks. The international community, the main players in the international community, would just happily sit down and watch while Gaza is being turned into a slaughterhouse. So we can't trust anyone. We have to fight for our rights, and we have to control every aspect of our lives. And if we don't manage to do that, because this is it's not just a simple choice that we make. If we don't manage to do this, we can't continue living in this sort of weird occupation situation where Israel manages to control the land, control the border, tax the population, control the trade, control everything, but provides none of the services. So if we don't have sovereignty over our lives, then we shouldn't be sponsoring this occupation. We shouldn't be running hospitals under occupation. We shouldn't be running schools under occupation. If Israel wants to control this population, then they need to also run these services. We shouldn't continue having this sort of burden-free occupation that Israel has been enjoying for at least 30 years since Oslo, where they just where they decide for the Palestinians everything, like even what they eat and how they live their lives, where to go, who to travel, who's not allowed to travel, but at the same time they provide no service. And now when they're talking about the day after, they talk about a complete military control of Gaza, but no control over the civil, no civilian presence, and they pose this as a good thing, while in fact it means that they just want the benefits of occupation and the profit of occupation without bearing any of the responsibilities under international law. And this situation is, I think, was allowed mainly because of Oslo and because of the two-state solution, and because of this this trick of talking about devising a solution. And this brings me to how our relationship with our enemy, with our oppressor, with our opponents should be redefined. The way Israel and the Americans and the international backers of Israel of the occupation have been approaching the Palestinian question has always been about devising a solution that works. Regardless what the solution is, no one wants to think about the rights and the moral foundation of the solution. As long as it works, and it often works, and actually always works in favor of Israel, then everyone is happy. Like even before October 7th, the war in October 7th, even before then, there was a solution that was working, and actually the world started to believe that the Palestinian question was sort of resolved. And Netanyahu was, so joyful in the UN, talking about the new Middle East, completely ignoring the presence of Palestinians, because for them the Palestinians were being oppressed quietly. They didn't inconvenience anyone. In fact, they were actually Israel was profiting from the occupation of Gaza and of the West Bank. And there was a relatively stable Middle East. So let's just talk about normalizing relationships between Israel and Arab states. So it was a convenient solution that worked for Israel. And as long as it didn't inconvenience anyone, then it didn't inconvenience anyone. Everyone was happy with it. And this is the problem with fixating on trying to find a solution, whether it's a two-state or a one-state or a colony on Mars. It just doesn't matter without acknowledging and recognizing the rights of the Palestinians that should and must underpin any sort of solution that we're talking about. So our fight, in fact, we shouldn't try to find a solution to the conflict, because the occupation is not our problem. It's the problem of Israel, the problem of the US, the problem of the backers, the people, the states, the parties who created this problem. They must find a solution. What we must do is to fight for our rights, to have a political discourse that is based on acknowledging the rights, the political and the national rights of the Palestinians. Once this is done, when this is acknowledged, once this is recognized, we can move on to talk about solutions, because any solution then becomes a technical matter, and it should be underpinned by these rights of the Palestinians. It would be very easy to devise any solution that would work as long as we know why we are, what grounds we're building the solution on. This is why now when Israel talks, when Israel is presented with this so difficult question about a Palestinian state, they say, oh, it's not time for gifts. And it's true, actually, it's not time for gifts. But the fact that they think of this as a gift, it actually reflects what the past at least 30 years have done. They made the question of, they made the oppression of the Palestinian completely void of any meaningful conversation about rights, or about right to freedom, or right to self-determination, to become more about, okay, let's just find a solution. Any solution would do, as long as it works. So I think this is how, or at least this is how I hope we would move on from this war, and this is how it should redefine our political narrative and our fight for freedom.
Thank you very much, Shlaim. I think those are just really important points about all of us who are involved in the solidarity movement in the West, that we need to be really constantly thinking about Palestinian human rights and the rights of Palestinians, because I think that's really constantly missing. And that's why then you get crazy statements such as there was peace on October the 6th, that I'm sure we've all seen across the media. So I'm going to now move on to Maryam Ahmed. I'm really pleased to have Maryam with us. She's an activist, she's an aspiring academic, and working towards creating community building and building the gap between academia and people's lived realities. Maryam has been absolutely pivotal in organising a lot of demonstrations here in Oxford, and she had, in both the motions that we had in council, both on the ceasefire and on opposing the BDS bill, Maryam spoke absolutely brilliantly in council. So Maryam, I guess moving on to you, I'd really like you to just tell us a little bit about how you think, considering what Shlaim's points are about Palestinian human rights, how do you think that people who want to be involved in Oxford, in your local area, how they can get involved and be more active? And also, I guess I want to know what, as a young person, as a person living in Oxford, what does the Palestinian battle fight really mean to you? Thank you.
I'll start with your second question and kind of what the Palestine movement means to me. So my auntie spent a lot of time in the West Bank in Nablus, and I have Palestinian family, so I grew up with Palestine being a very important part of my life, and that's why I'm so passionate about it. And I myself am from occupied Kashmir, which again in 1947 was a Muslim majority state which was given to a Hindu Maharaja. So I think that's why especially people of the Global South and young people of the Global South recognise this collective struggle against colonial oppression, and that's kind of why the chant we say globalised the Intifada, because we as people of the Global South have the scars of colonialism imprinted on us, and that's why we feel so passionately about the Palestinian struggle. That's why we say in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. So I guess that's why I'm passionate about it. I guess I'd say in terms of organising and mobilising, I think we need to forget any sort of hope or faith we have in the establishment. I personally have no faith in the establishment, because why would I have a faith in an establishment that was created on the backs of colonialism, that is deep red with the blood of empire, and those laws and institutions are built for the powerful, made by the powerful, so why would I have any hope in them? What I do have hope is in the power of the people and the power of the collective, which is why I have such an issue with an individualism narrative that happens sometimes in activism, where we congratulate ourselves and say, well done, what I did, pat on the back for what I did, when it should never be about what an individual person has achieved or done. It should be as what can we as a collective working together do for Palestine. And then I guess building on that, when we do these protests, I love protests, I think protests are great, but they should never happen in a vacuum. So protests need to be accompanied by various other actions. So we need to have sit-ins, we need to have boycott campaigns, we need to apply sustained pressure on institutions, and we need to hit capitalism where it hurts, which is deep in their pockets. And that's the only way we will get change, is if we, putting aside, I know there's been a lot of sectarianism and issues within Oxford and the activism space, which is why I think we really need to put our differences aside. Whatever squabbles, petty things we have going on, we need to put them aside for the greater good, because if we continue down the route of having very scattered movements and scattered things going on in different places, it's not going to work. We need to have localised action that everyone is a part of, that's coherent, because if it's all over the place, it's not going to work. And what I get inspiration from is the 1970s civil rights movement and Malcolm X, who was assassinated, his anniversary of his assassination was yesterday, may he rest in power, and how he talked about by any means necessary. And I see that as a lived reality of the people in the global south. Like, we say these words and we throw them around, but it's a very much a lived reality that the people in Palestine, the people across the global south face, is they face by any means necessary, because they have no other choice. So yes, my main takeaway is that we need to stop having this false hope in the establishment and work together as a community and as the people of Oxford to apply pressure on institutions.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up. So thank you, everyone. It's been brilliant. So please do sign up on the sheet if you want to join the WhatsApp group. We have got a vigil at the hospital next Friday. Please do join us and keep in touch. And don't forget about the Boycott, Divestment and Sanction website. Have a look at that and see what you can do. Thank you all for your patience and being with us. Take care.